You've been living a fantasy, haven't you? A beautiful, comfortable delusion where you believe that good intentions matter more than results, where you think that being nice automatically makes you worthy of respect, where you imagine that the world operates according to the moral principles you learned in childhood. But Machiavelli knew better. He understood that there comes a moment in every person's life when they must choose between remaining naive and becoming effective, between staying innocent and gaining power over their own destiny. This is that moment for you. This is when your real life begins. Most people never make this transition. They live their entire lives as children in adult bodies, expecting fairness from an unfair world, expecting loyalty from people who owe them nothing, expecting reward for virtue in a universe that rewards results. They wonder why they're overlooked for promotions while less qualified but more strategic colleagues advance. They wonder why their relationships are one-sided, why their generosity is taken for granted, why their good heart seems to be a liability rather than an asset. They blame others. They blame circumstances. They blame everything except the one thing they have the power to change: their own fundamental misunderstanding of how the world actually works. Machiavelli wasn't cynical. He was realistic. He looked at human nature without the rose-colored glasses that most people refuse to remove, and he saw what you're only beginning to glimpse: that people are primarily motivated by self-interest, that power respects power, that good intentions without the ability to execute them are worthless, and that the gap between how things should be and how things are is where most dreams go to die. But here's what separates those who despair from this knowledge and those who use it: understanding that this isn't a tragedy to be lamented but a game to be mastered. Your real life begins when you stop expecting the world to care about your feelings and start caring about your results. It begins when you realize that respect is not given but taken, that loyalty is not earned through kindness but through demonstrating value, that your worth is not determined by your intentions but by your ability to achieve your objectives. This doesn't make you evil, it makes you effective. This doesn't make you manipulative, it makes you strategic. This doesn't make you heartless, it makes you powerful enough to protect what you actually care about. Think about the people in your life who consistently get what they want. Not the ones who complain about unfairness, not the ones who expect others to recognize their worth automatically, but the ones who somehow always seem to land on their feet, who navigate obstacles with grace, who command respect without demanding it. What do they have in common? They understand the game. They know that every interaction is an exchange of value, that every relationship has a power dynamic, that every situation has rules that may not be spoken but are absolutely real. But here's where most people misunderstand Machiavelli's teachings. They think it's about becoming cold and calculating, about manipulating others for selfish gain, about abandoning all moral principles in pursuit of power. That's not what he meant at all. He meant that you must understand the reality of power dynamics in order to operate effectively within them, that you must be strategic about your goals if you want to achieve them, that you must be willing to make difficult choices if you want to avoid being at the mercy of those who will make them for you. Your real life begins when you stop being a victim of circumstances and start being an architect of outcomes. This requires you to develop what Machiavelli called virtù, not virtue in the modern sense, but excellence in the art of living, the ability to adapt to circumstances while maintaining your core objectives, the skill to be both the lion and the fox depending on what the situation demands. Sometimes you need the lion's courage to face challenges directly. Sometimes you need the fox's cunning to navigate around obstacles that can't be overcome through force alone. This is not about becoming someone you're not. It's about becoming who you actually are beneath all the conditioning and expectations that have been layered on top of your authentic self. Most of what you think of as your personality is actually just a collection of responses you've learned to get approval from others, strategies you developed to avoid conflict, masks you wear to fit in with people who may not even respect you. Your real life begins when you stop performing for an audience that isn't even paying attention and start living for objectives that actually matter to you. But let's be honest about what this transformation costs. You'll have to give up the comfortable fiction that everyone has your best interests at heart. You'll have to acknowledge that some people in your life are energy drains who take more than they give, that some relationships are built on convenience rather than genuine connection, that some situations require you to choose between being liked and being respected. You'll have to accept that good people sometimes have to make hard choices, That leadership often means making decisions that not everyone will understand or appreciate. That protecting what you value sometimes requires tactics that your younger, more naive self would have found distasteful. This is where most people turn back. They reach this moment of recognition and decide that they'd rather remain victims than become agents of their own destiny. They'd rather complain about unfairness than learn to work within reality. They'd rather maintain their moral superiority than develop actual power. But if you're listening to this, if you've made it this far, then you're different. You understand that the choice isn't between being good and being effective. It's between being ineffectively good and being strategically good, between having pure intentions and having the power to act on those intentions. Machiavelli understood that the most moral thing you can do is to be effective in pursuing moral goals. What's the point of having the right values if you don't have the power to implement them? What's the value of being principled if your principles keep you powerless while less scrupulous people shape the world according to their vision? The truly ethical person learns to play the game well enough to win, not for the sake of winning, but for the sake of being able to influence outcomes in ways that align with their deepest values. Your real life begins when you stop waiting for permission to pursue what you want and start creating the conditions that make your success inevitable. This means developing a deep understanding of human nature, not so you can exploit it, but so you can work with it rather than against it. It means learning to see the world as it is rather than as you wish it were, not so you can become cynical, but so you can be realistic about what strategies will actually work. It means accepting that power is not inherently evil, but is simply a tool that can be used for good or ill, and that leaving it in the hands of those who will use it poorly is itself a moral failure. Most people fear power because they fear corruption, but Machiavelli knew that the real corruption comes from powerlessness, from being so ineffective that you can't protect what you care about, so naive that you can't see threats coming, so unprepared that you become a victim of others' ambitions. The person who refuses to develop strategic thinking doesn't remain pure, they remain vulnerable. The person who won't learn to navigate power dynamics doesn't stay innocent, they stay ineffective. Your real life begins when you realize that every interaction is a negotiation, every relationship is an exchange of value, every situation is an opportunity to either increase or decrease your influence. This doesn't mean you become transactional in your relationships. It means you become conscious of what you're bringing to them and what you're receiving from them. It doesn't mean you manipulate people. It means you understand how influence works so you can use it ethically and effectively. Think about the areas of your life where you feel most frustrated, most powerless, most at the mercy of others' decisions. What do these situations have in common? Chances are they're areas where you've been operating according to wishful thinking rather than strategic thinking, where you've been hoping that good intentions would be enough, where you've been waiting for others to recognize your worth rather than demonstrating your value in ways they can't ignore. Your real life begins when you take responsibility, not just for your actions, but for your results. When you stop making excuses for why things didn't work out and start analyzing what you could have done differently. When you stop blaming others for not giving you what you want and start figuring out how to create the conditions where they want to give it to you. When you stop being surprised by predictable human behavior and start anticipating it, planning for it, working with it, rather than against it. This is not about becoming cold or calculating. It's about becoming effective. It's about understanding that the best way to serve others is often to serve yourself first, that the best way to be generous is to first ensure you have something to give, that the best way to be moral is to first ensure you have the power to act on your morals. The person who sacrifices their own effectiveness for the sake of appearing virtuous often ends up helping no one, while the person who develops their power strategically can help many. Machiavelli wrote about the importance of appearing virtuous while being practical, but this isn't about deception. It's about understanding that good intentions without good execution help no one. It's about recognizing that the world judges you by your results, not your motivations, and that if you want to make a positive impact, you need to be effective at making that impact, not just sincere in wanting to make it. Your real life begins when you stop being shocked by selfishness and start accounting for it in your plans. When you stop being hurt by disloyalty and start building systems that don't depend on it. When you stop being disappointed by human nature and start working with it as it is, rather than as you wish it were. This doesn't make you pessimistic, it makes you prepared. This doesn't make you suspicious, it makes you strategic. The person living their real life understands that every situation has multiple levels of reality. what people say they want, what they actually want, and what they'll respond to. They understand that every person has both noble and selfish motivations, and that appealing to the right motivation in the right way is not manipulation, but communication. They understand that timing is everything, that context matters more than content, that how you present something is often more important than what you're presenting. Your real life begins when you stop trying to be understood and start trying to be effective. When you stop expecting fairness and start creating advantage. When you stop waiting for opportunities and start manufacturing them. When you stop hoping for the best and start preparing for the realistic range of outcomes. This is not pessimism. This is power. This is not cynicism. This is clarity. But perhaps most importantly, your real life begins when you realize that all of this strategic thinking, all of this understanding of power dynamics, all of this realistic assessment of human nature is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. The goal is not to become a master manipulator, but to become a master of your own destiny. The goal is not to exploit others, but to free yourself from being exploited. The goal is not to gain power for its own sake, but to gain enough power to live according to your own values, rather than being forced to live according to others' values. The truly Machiavellian person is not the villain of popular imagination, but the protagonist of their own story. Someone who refuses to be a victim of circumstances, who takes responsibility for their outcomes, who understands that good intentions without effective action are worthless, and who develops the strategic thinking necessary to turn their values into reality, rather than just keeping them as beautiful ideals that never get implemented. This is your invitation to step into your real life, to stop living in the fantasy that the world owes you anything, and start creating the reality where you owe yourself everything. To stop waiting for permission and start taking responsibility. To stop hoping for fairness and start creating advantage. To stop being surprised by human nature and start working with it strategically. Your real life is waiting for you, but it requires you to give up the comfortable illusions that have been keeping you small, scared, and ineffective. The question is, are you ready to begin? The path forward requires you to embrace what Machiavelli called the lion and the fox within yourself, knowing when to be direct and forceful, and when to be subtle and adaptive. Most people operate from only one mode. They're either always aggressive or always passive, always confrontational or always accommodating, always honest to a fault or always deceptive. But real strategic thinking requires flexibility, the ability to read situations accurately and respond appropriately, rather than defaulting to the same approach regardless of context. Your real life begins when you develop this situational intelligence, when you learn to ask not, what is the right thing to do, in some abstract moral sense, but what is the effective thing to do given the specific people, circumstances, and objectives involved in this particular situation. This doesn't mean abandoning your values. It means learning to implement them strategically rather than blindly. The person who insists on being brutally honest in every situation, regardless of consequences, is not more moral than the person who chooses their moments for honesty carefully. They're simply less strategic. Consider how differently you would approach a situation where you need something from someone who values loyalty versus someone who values competence versus someone who values innovation. The naive approach is to present your request the same way to everyone, hoping that your sincerity will be enough. The strategic approach is to understand what motivates each person and frame your request in terms that appeal to their specific drives and values. This isn't manipulation. It's communication that actually works. Most people resist this level of strategic thinking because they've been taught that it's somehow dishonest or calculating. But what could be more dishonest than approaching every situation with the same generic approach, regardless of whether it's likely to achieve your objectives? What could be more calculating than refusing to consider the other person's perspective and motivations when deciding how to interact with them? True respect for others includes respect for their actual psychological makeup, not just their stated preferences. Your real life begins when you stop apologizing for having objectives and start getting serious about achieving them. When you stop pretending that you don't care about outcomes and start developing the skills necessary to influence those outcomes. When you stop feeling guilty about wanting things and start feeling responsible for creating the conditions that make getting those things possible. The person who claims to be above considerations of strategy and influence is usually just someone who has never been in a position where strategy and influence were necessary for protecting what they cared about. And here's what will surprise you as you develop this Machiavellian mindset. You'll actually become more genuine, not less. When you stop performing innocence and niceness for social approval, when you stop pretending that you don't have personal interests and ambitions, when you stop hiding your real thoughts and feelings behind socially acceptable platitudes, you'll discover a version of yourself that is both more honest and more effective. The person who acknowledges their own self-interest is more trustworthy than the person who pretends they don't have any, because at least you know where they stand. The truly strategic person doesn't need to lie because they've learned to tell the truth in ways that serve their objectives. They don't need to manipulate because they've learned to create genuine value for others while pursuing their own goals. They don't need to be fake because they've integrated their ambitions with their authentic self rather than seeing them as contradictory forces. This integration is what separates real Machiavellian thinking from the cartoonish villain version that most people imagine when they hear his name. Your real life begins the moment you stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to pursue what you want and start giving yourself that permission. The moment you stop expecting the world to make sense according to your childhood understanding of fairness and start making sense of the world as it actually operates. The moment you stop being surprised that people act in their own self-interest and start accounting for that reality in all your planning and decision-making. This transformation isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process of becoming more strategic, more realistic, more effective in everything you do. Each situation becomes an opportunity to practice reading people accurately, to test your understanding of motivations and incentives, to refine your ability to influence outcomes rather than just hoping for the best. Each setback becomes data about what works and what doesn't, rather than evidence that the world is unfair or that you're somehow inadequate. The person living their real life understands that power is not a dirty word but a neutral tool that can be used for good or ill, and that the responsible thing to do is to develop that tool rather than leaving it undeveloped and therefore useless when you need it most. They understand that influence is not inherently corrupting but is simply the ability to affect outcomes, and that refusing to develop that ability is itself a choice with moral consequences, usually the consequence of being unable to protect or promote what you claim to value. If this message has awakened something in you, if you recognize the truth in these words and feel ready to stop living in fantasy and start living strategically, then you're part of a rare group of people who understand that real power comes from understanding reality as it is, not as we wish it were. Subscribe to this channel because we're building a community of individuals who refuse to remain victims of circumstances, who understand that effectiveness is a moral imperative, and who are committed to developing the strategic thinking necessary to turn their values into results. Hit that like button if you're ready to step into your real life, to stop making excuses and start making progress, to stop hoping for the best and start creating the conditions for success. And leave a comment below sharing one area of your life where you're ready to stop being naive and start being strategic. Because acknowledging where you've been operating from wishful thinking rather than realistic thinking is the first step toward developing the power to change your circumstances rather than being changed by them. Your real life begins now, but only if you're willing to leave your fantasy life behind.